President Trump just sent out a post on Truth Social. I'm going to read it to you both and get your reaction to it. It's a long one. Just completed my 2-hour call with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. I believe it went very well. Russia and Ukraine will immediately start negotiations toward a ceasefire and, more importantly, an end to the war. The conditions for that will be negotiated between the two parties, as it can only be, because they know the details of negotiation that nobody else would be aware of. The tone and spirit of the conversation were excellent. If it wasn't, I would say so now rather than later. Russia wants to do large-scale trade with the United States when this catastrophic bloodbath is over, and I agree. There is a tremendous opportunity for Russia to create massive amounts of jobs and wealth. Its potential is unlimited. Likewise, Ukraine can get a great beneficiary of trade in the process of rebuilding its country. Negotiations between Russia and Ukraine will begin immediately. Okay, he goes on to say a little bit more, but I want to get your thoughts so far on this talk. Okay, hold on for 1 second. Stand by. We're going to go to Ed O'Keefe, who's live at the White House, to get his reaction to what we just saw on Truth Social. Ed, you just saw that tweet, or excuse me, that post on Truth Social from the president. I want to get your take.
The last sentence there is interesting. He says that the Pope has expressed an interest and a willingness to serve as the venue for talks between Ukraine and Russia. There had been some suggestions of this since Pope Leo was chosen, that he might take an active role, or that the Vatican would step up to offer its facilities, its diplomatic power. It is a bit of a diplomatic force around the world, and of course Pope Leo's pushing for peace there and in other parts of the world. But he's the president there, confirming now that the Pope has expressed directly a willingness to host those talks, should it make sense to do so. And we know Pope Francis and President Biden previously were quite concerned about this situation as well, perhaps more so than the situation in Gaza. Pope Francis was. Leo now signaling he wants to play a role of some kind, at least as a venue for these talks, which is essentially a neutral location. He confirms there, though, the length of this call, about 2 hours or so. Putin had said that already in the last hour. But there's no firm resolution, no plan for the leaders to meet. Instead, Russia and Ukraine are going to continue talking, and it appears the president and European leaders are encouraging those two parties to continue doing so. In other words, saying, you don't get to meet with me until you sort out details with the Ukrainians. But whether or not the Russians get serious about this, whether or not they're really going to discuss a ceasefire, if the terms are so far apart, get out of Ukraine, keep the territory, we'll see.
So was President Trump alluding to essentially the ball is in Ukraine and Russia's court, that he's done what he can do, now they have to essentially figure it out? Is that what he's saying?
Yeah, I think ultimately the rest of the world realizes that this has got to be a deal cut between those two countries. And what he's signaling there is that he's not going to be the one to negotiate the terms of surrender or ceasefire for either of these two parties. That's in line with what Europe wants. That's consistent with how the Biden administration handled things. They used to say nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. But the phone call, at least today, could be seen as a jump start or a restart of those talks between the two countries. And the president saying, look, you sort this out, we'll cut some economic deals with you like we're cutting them around the rest of the world. But you got to sort this out first. And if the Pope offers you a place to meet and to stay, you should take him up on that. Probably not Putin and Zelensky directly, at least at first, but very likely the two parties and their underlings negotiating details before the leaders ever meet.
Yeah, this all is very extraordinary. Now, the Pope is involved in some of this. Ed O'Keefe, thank you so much for that breaking news update. I want to bring back Brian Taylor, who's the director of the Moynihan Institute. Brian, what did you make of that post on Truth Social and the developments within the past couple of minutes on these negotiations?
I don't think it shows much change. I'm not surprised to learn that President Trump thought it was, quote unquote, a great phone call. But honestly, things have not moved that far. We know that in the negotiations last week between the Russians and Ukrainians in Istanbul, that Russia came in with a very hard line. And I think that continues to be their line when they talk about solving the root causes of the conflict. I think the fact that they're talking might lead to some things like the prisoner exchange that was announced recently. But overall, from the Ukrainian point of view, I would note that a week ago, Europe and the United States were putting immediate heavy sanctions on Russia if they did not agree to a ceasefire. And here we are a week later, Russia has not agreed to that ceasefire. There's still no talk about further sanctions. And President Putin, in fact, President Trump is talking about the opposite, about the future of economic deals between Russia and the United States. So it doesn't seem to be that there are any sticks being imposed on Russia for opposing a ceasefire at this point.
And I'm curious what you thought of his mentioning of Pope Leo in that Truth Social post and the role and the influence he may have over peace negotiations.
Pope Leo has shown a genuine interest in trying to stop this war even before he was Pope. And he's sending increasingly positive signals that he would be willing to host such a meeting. I'm not sure the venue ultimately, though, is the issue. I think the real issue is that Putin wants Russia to have what he would consider a quote unquote friendly Ukraine, which means one in the Russian orbit in some fashion. And Ukraine wants to define its own sovereign path, which involves eventually joining the EU and NATO and getting its territory back. So given those two positions, I would say we're not really any closer to a deal than we were before this flurry of activity. And the question remains, what will the U.S. do? Will it, as J.D. Vance said yesterday, walk away from this war? Because if the U.S. walks away from the war, that's actually good news for President Putin. If the U.S. stops supporting Ukraine, that will give him, he thinks, a freer hand to continue the war against Ukraine.
In that post, he also brought up trade. I mean, how big a role is that playing in all of this?
I think it's a big issue in President Trump's mind, but I would note that Russia is not a major trade partner of the United States. It's, I think, below 50 in the rank of countries that we trade with. And I don't see the prospects for major trade deals, but I think that's something that Russia and Putin have been trying to interest the Trump administration in, to talk about a great economic future the two sides could have if we could just move beyond this war. I don't really see the basis for a major reorientation of the U.S.-Russia trade deal, though. But Putin would certainly like the U.S. to lift sanctions against Russia as part of that economic cooperation, which again would make it easier for him to continue his war against Ukraine.
Brian Taylor, thank you so much and for sticking around to talk this out as this breaking news is unfolding during this show.